welcome everyone to another episode of Notes from the Aleph. An Aleph is, of course, the high point from which all things are visible, and from our vantage point, we'll be looking at tabletop role-playing games, their design, and the theory behind those designs. And around here, our motto is to be fair, build up, and have fun. I'm your host, GriffinVarro, joined by our editor, Theta, our local designer, Norman Rafferty, our good friend and GM, RedRabbit, and today our guest, Lessons Learned, over on his own Twitch channel. And when it comes to tabletop gamings, I have 15 years of experience running, playing, and frequently fixing problematic rule sets at the table. Pronouns are he, him, and they, them. And next person.
I'm Lessons Learned. I'm a writer of speculative fiction. I have my first book, Night and Stars, over at Amazon for 99 cents, a collection of short stories. I also have been GMing various systems for the last 20 plus years. Yes, I am that old. And I'm also dipping my toes, or actually going headful on the design space with several projects, including the one I'm working right now called 2980, a sci-fi retro 1980s adventure not video game, but tabletop RPG.
And I'm RedRabbit. I'm currently GMing our Ironclaw Second Edition game here on the Ractus channel. I am 3-year professional GM. I also consider myself a student of tabletop game design.
And that leaves Norman, who needs to unmute.
Ooh.
More exciting when I'm unmuted.
Exactly.
Clearly, I sound better muted, don't I? Hello, I'm Norman Rafferty. I have less than a year experience working with microphones, apparently. I was nerdy enough a long time ago to do an entire statistical analysis to discover the entire percentages of odds of every Shadowrun and World of Darkness roll. And that started the long road where I now work for Sanguine Games, where we make tabletop games.
It's a slippery slope, everyone. Never do statistics or Monte Carlo simulations, not even once.
And just imagine the buckets of D10s and D6s rolling in
but we're not doing the probability one today. What is our subject today, Griffin?
The first subject today we have is game complexity as a toxic gatekeeper. So this is a tough one to go ahead and word out. So I'm just going to go ahead and open up the air on this one. So, Rafferty, why don't you go ahead and explain what you mean by this topic?
4M one, right?
4M, yes, that's what it's going to be called.
Yes.
The 4M
Mountains
rule.
Of mechanics multiply mistakes is the 4M rule.
That is a mouthful.
Right. Well, that's why we call it the 4M rule. Mountains of mechanics multiply mistakes. And what that basically means is the more rules you have, the more mistakes you can make. Because obviously, if we didn't have rules, we wouldn't be making any mistakes now, would we? I think if folks have heard the term Heartbreaker, has anybody heard that before as a game?
Yeah. Those are like
certainly.
the indie game scene, right?
Yeah. What is a Heartbreaker?
It's a game where you have high anticipation and it lets you down because it's actually terrible.
Yeah, but I mean,
okay.
Yeah, that's usually usually the way they let you down is they usually have a lot of bizarre or strange rules. A lot of people, when they start game designing, they find their favorite game and they think, this is my favorite game, but what will make it better is more rules. So let's put more of them in there. I mean, obviously, if like 9 alignments are good, then 49 alignments would be like 9 times better.
I do have a rule for that, though.
What do you call that?
I call it the rule of threes, which is a counter to that. Because when I started designing, I got into that. I really go like, I like 4th edition D&D, and so let's make more of that. And people go like 4th edition D&D. Oh my God, no. But seriously, because I like the simplicity of the edition and all that. There's just a good thing about 4th edition, but
because that's an interesting comparison. Yeah.
I said basically.
Go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah. So basically, I said, okay, I'm going to try to keep every rule that I make to have at least 3 steps or less as a rule. That way, everything else that comes along, it has to be necessary in order for this to make sense. Otherwise, I'm writing too much. I'm putting too much that I don't need to put in here. Now, that's a rule. It doesn't apply to everything, but it's one I use for myself.
Right. No, definitely. Like you may know that I am Rafferty. I am the anti-old school. Old school was worse. We already did the podcast. Old school's worse than you remember, right?
Yes.
Yeah, right. So a lot of old school games often this isn't quite phrasing it, but took sort of a cookbook approach to it, which is if you ever cooked, you may know that the recipe in the book isn't ironclad. It's kind of like a guideline. Like you often, if you're cooking, you look at this and go, obviously this needs more pepper, or obviously this needs more garlic, or something else is more suitable for your group. So a lot of early games were kind of marketed that way. You can read the opening text where they say, "What is role playing like? To understand this, we must go back to ancient Greece." That intro paragraph that nobody reads. So in theory, they started putting the books filled with rules. And what started to happen was that when they sent these books out to people, they other people started to read these rules and interpret them. And like today, you can easily see on the internet that there's forums where people will discuss, like, what does this mean? Like, if this lets me sacrifice attack bonus for a bonus to damage, what does that mean at different levels? Is that worth it at level 5? Is it still worth it at level 10? It's just a trap build. How do I optimize my build? People go through all of that.
Mm-hmm.
And the more complicated the book is, the more, the fewer people can play it, and the more people will sort of toss this stuff out. And I'm glad you brought up D&D 4th edition, because that's an interesting one, because D&D 4th edition is often accused of being like way too complicated. Like folks are just saying like there's just way too much rules in this, or it's too much like a war game. Why is everything in squares? How come I can fire a crossbow 9 times? But what's weird to me about that is D&D 4th edition is way simpler than some of the previous D&D editions that came before it. And D&D 5th edition is still pretty complicated. I mean, when you have to choose all your spells, you get to 3rd level and you have to choose a path, which can turn you into a fighter, which has those skill dice. Does anybody play a fighter with those weird D&D 5 skill dice?
I do, actually, currently in Lessons game, actually. You have a very limited set of abilities, and you spend the dice as points in order to use those abilities.
Right, and the list is listed in alphabetical order instead of precedence order, so you have to go through that to pick. I mean, that's ultra complicated, right?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah,
and like when people talk about 4th edition, like the complexity is definitely just the verbosity of it. There's a lot of text to read, even if that text is simple. But the organizational structure of it is pretty sound, where it's like you explicitly have this many encounter abilities, this many dailies, and you have 2 choices. Pick one. There you go, and you're done.
Right.
Whereas with the fighter stuff, it's like, here's the entire list. You get to pick them at any time. And, maybe depending on how the game is run, some might be more worthwhile, some might not be. Maybe no monster ever attacks you, so riposte is worthless or something like that.
Right. Well, but what I think what the good selling point is of D&D 5 is somehow D&D 5 is still an extremely complicated game. It's more complicated than many of its peers, like Call of Cthulhu or Chronicles of Darkness. It's pretty complicated, but it's presented in such a way that it doesn't make people feel like it is complicated.
Right. I think like the most important thing they took away from 4th edition was giving you very discrete increments and parts as you go, which is how games should probably be.
Yeah, I think the way you build a character, you don't get everything up front like, hey, you can do this and that's like, no, that's 3rd level. You get to play from 1 3rd level. And I think now people like to start at 3rd level once they get used to the system. But the idea is if you're a first player, you only have to worry about what 1st level can do. And then they give you a little chunk more 2nd level. Once you get to 3rd level, you're like, oh, okay. I mean, people who are playing are already thinking that they want to be, dual wielding, chainsaws at 5th level, whatever. But it's the process, right? They channel you into like, don't worry about anything else. Worry about your fighter. Worry about your bard. Something like that.
Yeah.
So it helps a lot.
I think it's somewhat of an improvement. I think it was handled a lot better back in I'm going to call it the Moldvay fork, the D&D basic set, the one that started with Moldvay and later turned into the BECMI that folks are used to, and then later the D&D Encyclopedia. That fork of D&D. You guys know what the BECMI one was in '83?
I have
I
heard
did.
of it.
I know the
Okay.
Cyclopedia and I know the mole. I think that's the medium
Because
set.
that one was
one.
presented as the basic set was levels 1 through 3, and then the expert set were levels above that. And then once you maxed out that, they had the champion set, and then the master set and the immortal set. They broke it down into different levels, and also they broke down some of the complexity into different levels. Like, for example, blinding as a mechanic, like spells that blind people, starts off extremely basic in basic D&D, and then expert D&D had more rules to do it. It's one of the few games I've seen that wanted the game to become more complex, but slowly inculcated you in it. These days, a lot of what people are, well, I shouldn't say a lot of people. I think there's the designer, I think, has to look at how much complex they want to make the game, because you can't sell people an empty book. And also there's still a mindset from folks that a game is being supported if it has more material coming out for it. It's a strange paradox in gaming where someone will say, hey, let's play Pathfinder. Look at all the material that comes out for it. Pause, next sentence. By the way, we're not using 1,200 pages of rules. I mean, it's great that they exist, but we're not going to use them.
Yeah, I think that's one of the problems that can also be a bit of a barrier. It's like if I come in a game when it's just released and I just buy the player handbook or the equivalent, that's all I have to take, and I slowly can take in the books 1 or 2 a year if I have the money and all that, then fine, no problem. But if I come into the hobby 5 years later and there's, like, say, you release at least, and 4 books is a no number for the history of Dungeons and Dragons, just to mention it, it could be a dozen books. And it's like, where do I start? But do I need the book that talks about witches and mind magic, or do I need the book about underwater combat and
right? And you can
ships
just end up completely overloaded on that. And so when we look at like different spheres, like video game tutorials kind of have the idea down pat. It's like you want to introduce people to a mechanic, let them play 30 minutes, introduce them to another, and no tutorial ever really ends. You're always getting new stuff. And a lot of board games are doing what we just said BCI did, right? Where you have an introductory set of rules and it says, all right, now that you've played your first game, here's more rules on top of that, which will make the game more interesting or complex now that you understand the basics of it. Yeah, but there's not a lot of that in tabletop.
In fact, my issue with D&D 5 is people are saying, well, D&D 5 is simpler. And I'm saying it's not simple enough. You start the game as a fighter, you immediately have to go choose a bunch of skills that you don't know what they do. You have to choose what your starting path. So are you going to be a sword and board person? Are you going to be a two-handed person? What are you going to pick? That gives you a special ability. You get the heroic surge, which allows you to get an extra attack per round. You start with a whole bunch of special abilities beginning the game. And then go choose your equipment. I mean, sure, there's a fast build for it, but you have bows and swords and all that kind of stuff. And all of that is at level 1. They dump all of that on you.
Itemizing equipment is definitely the thing that I see the most players immediately stop and go brain dead at, because it's like, all right, here I have this shopping list, and now I have way too many choices. It is immediate decision paralysis, just inflicted by written word.
Oh yeah, I think equipment has like, we can do a whole thing on encumbrance. Nobody pays attention to that.
Definitely, yeah.
I just think like it was just a weird design choice because I mean, yeah, people are gonna go by and say, Rafferty, aren't your games really complicated at the beginning? It's like, yeah, we stopped doing that. For years, I've been a big fan of point buy games like Hero System, GURPS, and I guess Fate. These games that would, say, okay, you start the game with like a ball of points, like 50 or 100 points, and buy whatever you want. And I've become very soured on that because
you have to understand everything at once suddenly.
Yeah, we were getting reviews of our games that people were saying like things were impossible to do, and like you can't build a 2-gun fighter or whatever. And I was always like, I'm trying to figure out why people were saying that, because no, we gave you points to spend on anything you wanted, and then put things in the game that were buy this for 2 guns. But for some reason, reviewers who I assume know what they're talking about, or some players who might be new to this, could not bridge the gap of, here's $50, there on the shelf is stuff to buy, go buy what you want. they weren't getting there. And so as much as I love these games that gave me the freedom to build whatever I wanted, it was because it was a mechanic, because people had to parse through it and find it themselves. They weren't finding it. And so, I mean, I love games that let me do whatever the heck I want, because we could do a whole thing on that. But also, I think a lot of people just play these games to have fun.
Speaking of not having fun, hero system. So I've had my own experience with that, and I think this is probably a good example of a game that does not want you to play it. I think it is inscrutably complicated. So out of my group of local friends, I'm one of the nerdiest, and there's another person who's just about as nerdy, likes doing the math, and we spent like a good solid week literally pouring day after day over that just to figure out how it works. And by the end of it, we're like doing different little mathematical models just to figure out how like the purchases for powers with their benefits and downsides work, and trying to figure out which one of those makes sense. And at a certain point, no one else could possibly understand it without the same amount of study. We had complete control over how everyone else interprets the game, just because we did massive amounts of work trying to figure out how the broken mess works.
Yeah, I just got to make a statement here. It's not that hard. You just remember that a 3/4 limitation is the same as multiplying by 4 and dividing by 7.
But of course, what if you have multiple things? So what comes first? Do you do the benefits first or the drawbacks first?
Well, this is where I want to ask, like,
cheaper and more beneficial to you as a player.
So games like GURPS and Hero and Rollmaster and that sort of thing kind of fell out of favor. I'm interested in some of the newer gamers here. Like, I mean, have you encountered a game that you really wanted to play but was too complicated?
I think that was probably the feeling I had with Hero System, because at the time I was very excited to have an open-ended system. And then I played Mutants and Mastermind instead, and it's a lot simpler.
Even then, it was still complicated, because
comparatively, it was at least easier.
Yeah, I've seen that. That's I guess doesn't work for the opposite of the Heartbreaker, where somebody really likes a game and they make a version that's simpler, but then you go play it and it's like, well, yeah, but the original was a horrible mess, so this is just a mess.
Yeah, that's Cyberpunk Red, honestly. If you want a recent example,
there we go.
It's a great one.
A few people have experiences with that. I think one of our good friends Hugo could tell you.
Cyberpunk Red. I've worked with the people who worked on Cyberpunk 3rd Edition, which is an edition that many people don't know exists because because people hated it that much.
Well,
that's interesting.
There was a 20 after 2020. Like,
it's after 2020.
Revision. It was a revision, right? The revision of 2020, I believe it is.
Right. There's one after 2020, but before Red, and no one knows that one exists because nobody liked it.
But it isn't the Interlock Plus hero system that they created. That was a D10 or D6 alternate system that you could be used on both.
Well, see, that's a fascinating failed experiment. So speaking of the hero system Cyberpunk connection. Okay, so the hero system guys realized that they had speaking of a toxic gatekeeper, one review of hero system I really liked was for people who can't decide if they like calculus or superheroes more. And they realized that they had a gatekeeper in their game because it was so complicated where not only did you have to divide by fractions. Okay, what the hell? But not only do you have to divide by fractions, you have to multiply in the middle of combat. You would have to roll a die, subtract 1, and multiply your other damage to determine the stun damage and body damage, because you're doing stun damage and body damage and power damage in separate. So nobody wanted to play their game because it was too complicated. Like, people who loved it really loved it. So they teamed up with, of all people, the Cyberpunk people. They teamed up with Artel Saurian to make a new game system called the Fusion game system. And Fusion was supposed to be the best of Cyberpunk combined with the best of Hero System. And this is where I like tear up my gray hairs, because I'm guessing that none of you have ever heard of this.
Oh, I played it. I played it trying to. Well, I attempted it. Let me put it that way. And not just with Cyberpunk, but with Mechton Plus.
There we go, Mechton Plus. Yeah.
And that was a great book. Actually, the one that everybody remembers about Mechton Plus was Mechton Zeta, which was the build a robot way, right? Except that there were basically two people who actually knew the system and could build anything. and then people who thought they could learn the system, me, and could never build anything that they want. For some reason, you could never get the math rate, the points, etc., to get that one giant robot that was a real robot but had drill hands that could shoot from the shoulders or whatever. Right? The system promised you could do all of that, but you had to gain. And I realized the way they were doing it was that they had to hack the system. They had to hack the system to make it work.
Well,
they had to add extra steps to really make it work the way they always want.
And I'm just going to be mean here and say that, as much as I love generic and universal games, a major problem with the games is there's no such thing as a generic game. As soon as you start making rules to your game, you've made some decisions about what goes and what doesn't. And for a long time in gaming, there was a real problem of, should bullets kill people?
Well, obviously, no action movie here ever goes down to a gunshot wound, so of course they shouldn't, because you're so cool. And that goes back to where simulation is performance.
Well, you're supposed to be realistic.
Like, for example, now that years have passed and Final Fantasy VII has faded into obscurity because of its silliness, there was that opening segment of the game where Shinra guards shoot your character with bullets. They bounce off of his face, and he loses like 6% of his hit points. Everyone obviously thought that was way too silly and stopped playing the game immediately, right?
Oh yeah, definitely. No one ever has even heard of Final Fantasy VII. That's true, of course.
So Mechton was written before Grand Theft Auto showed up and gave us the idea that hot dogs could cure bullet wounds. A lot of older school games are designed to kill you instantly because bullets are deadly in the real world, therefore they should be deadly in the game. And Mechton was one of those games where because it's got so much mechanics in it. I mean, like, they promise you, look at all the cool Gundams on the front cover. You like Gundam, don't you? Where the heroes are so skilled they can see where barrels are pointing so they can dodge lasers. Actual Gundam lore.
Yeah.
So, right, so you say, well, I want to play a character like that. But unfortunately, the guys who wrote the game said, well, obviously in real life, you couldn't dodge a bullet, and getting shot by a bullet would kill you instantly or put you in the hospital. Therefore, we'll write the rules that way. And so you spend a lot of time trying to go through, like the mechanics are modeled that way, where everything does a crap ton of damage and bullets are incredibly likely to hit you. So you have to, go through all those mechanics to figure out what the designers were originally thinking. I guess we could call that, what is that, ludonarrative dissonance?
Right, where the story doesn't match the mechanics.
Right, where the story, and then you'll wind up, speaking of Gatekeeper, the people who show up to play it are annoying people like Rafferty, who have read the rules and have figured out what an optimal build is. And then they'll show up with an optimal build because they have no life and will go ahead and just do that. And then there's the problem where the optimal build according to the rules might not be what your story is supposed to be, which is a real problem with games that have crap tons of mechanics, because someone will find some weird combination and excel at that. And now you're in a big problem because you bought this book and it's got a bunch of rules in it that say this is what goes. But and someone in good faith bought that book and built a character according to those rules. But you guys don't want that to happen. You don't want someone to just dodge all bullets and kill people instantly. That's not a challenge. Or maybe, they have some power that's powered by the blood of orphans or something else that's not appropriate because somebody wrote some weird rule somewhere. So now you have to argue, now the GM has to argue with the player that, yes, we brought this rule book and I said we were going to do what's in this rule book, but now we're not going to do what's in this rule book. So stop paying attention to this rule book.
Right.
Yeah, that sounds to me like one of the phenomena that happens. So 3 phenomena, I sort of, again, rule 3, but in a different way, along the life of any, long living role playing game, which is rule graph, rule drift, and I forgot the other rule aspect of it. But essentially, rule bloat, rule graph, rule bloat, and rule drift. As you support the game, because most game publishing companies are mostly book publishing companies. You're there to sell books. So the idea is, well, if we publish more books, we're supposed to sell more books. Tell that to TSR in the 1990s. That didn't work.
Yep.
And
There's a reason why TSR had a warehouse full of unsold material. Because they weren't making what people wanted. And and also I'm gonna be really mean. Can I be mean? Is it okay if I'm mean?
Just this once, sure.
Tell us how you really feel.
Yeah, well, but tell us how I can say this also because I'm a published game designer. Okay, the people who show up to write for tabletop role-playing games are people who couldn't get jobs writing for computer games, novels, or television shows. So you're gonna get some very enthusiastic volunteers, and often what shows up in these books over a long period of time is whoever showed up that day and what they thought were cool. So you're having even less canon control than you would say in the Marvel Cinematic Universe or Star Trek, where they would have consistent editorial staff that would say, okay, we can't do this, we can't do that. No, Voyager can't go warp 9.6 because we said they could only do 9.2.
You got the continuity expert on scene who's like, no, the phaser was on that table during this scene. Don't you remember?
Yeah, or something like that. Like at least some editorial oversight. So you won't get a unified voice in these books. And also when it comes to books, there's the lesson, as I just mentioned, of TSR. When TSR went out of business in the 90s, WotC bought them out, and it was the Coast bought them out and found a warehouse full of unsold merchandise. And that's because a lot of the stuff they were making were stuff like Birthright and Red Steel and other names that none of you have ever heard of because no one was buying it. Because it wasn't, it didn't boost players. A lot of them were ways to make players jump through more hoops to do stuff. Like no one needs another book of magic item creation that just says, okay, you have to spend 12 months instead of 8 months making something. No one wanted to buy a book to become Nerf. People want to buy a book to become. You've probably had this situation where this player shows up. You guys are long GMs. Have you ever had that? You've seen the player show up and he's got, hey, the new Primal book just came out. Can I play a hunter? It's in the new book.
Oh, yeah. Back during 3.5, that literally happened just about every month. Where it's like, oh, hey, here's new content. I want to do the new content. Let's see it. And we were not wise enough at the time to realize that it could all be terribly busted or horribly written.
I'd like to play the Geomancer. They just cast spells from every list in the book. They can't possibly be game imbalanced, can it?
And going back to something that Lessons brought up earlier when we were talking about coming to a game late, and you had, now you have 12 of these books you have to be familiar with, and which ones do you use? And the answer is all of them, because the people that you play with, especially in this day and age of like D&D Beyond, where it kind of all gets conglomerated online, your players, if it's published, they think it's fair game. They want to play with the new options because it's better, because it's newer. So yeah, that's another thing to contend with, is that, people even today are still always going to shoot for the latest thing that they can have. Oh, Unearthed Arcana. I mean, no one reads this is playtest material. They're like, oh, look at this new thing. It's like, yeah, they say here on the label that new thing is broken. Oh, man. That's,
But it's a new thing, and it's cool, and it's an idea we want to do because maybe other material's stale.
It was published by the producers.
Desire for content.
So that's why I say about the 3 rules. Like, as you go along, you graph rules, because I remember the original Thief not the original Thief. The original Thief was more broken. But let's say AD&D first edition as earlier. And it was like, oh, hey, everything you do in D&D, roll a D20, add subtract multipliers, do this. But the Thief, we're going to have a point bank system with percentages. We're like, okay.
Don't forget to increase your saves versus death, by the way.
Yeah, but that's that's rule grafting. Wow. Adding rules that are not part of the core mechanic.
Right.
We have rule bloat, which is you keep adding rules. Say Shadowrun, say a certain company out of Mount Laurel, Michigan, which I won't mention them, personal reasons, and so you also have rule drift. It's in which you end up, like probably what happened with TSR was like a player would use like a paragraph of this one book for this one character, say Paladin. The other player will use another paragraph for a pet in the Elves books. They had cool dogs, and say somebody else will use another thing. So your entire party was spread out of a half a dozen, or sometimes 200 or 300 books. So it was all over the place. So you had this sort of very long line of rules that were from everywhere, and eventually you go, you know what? It must be better just to consolidate everything else, do a new edition, and start over again. Because Why, if I have to keep picking books to go that paragraph 6, page 97 on the dwarves book, but I need to know what the new breath weapon and the dragons and dragon gods books, do over there, it just becomes unwieldy. And
Well,
then that company
definitely that.
kept basically telling you in the foreword that we put all the rules we couldn't put in the last book. This book. But there were so many rules we're going to put in that goes into the next book. You're like,
right. And
Kevin, I hate you.
Basically, I mean, I think we're all in agreement here. I think the big thing that makes a lot of this fall apart is the lack of oversight. I mean, like there's supposed to be a line editor who goes through all of the books and makes sure that, first of all, the mechanics make sense if there are new ones that are introduced. And secondly, to make sure that they have some level of balancing with other ones. And I think the third thing that doesn't show up a lot is the flavor issue with it. Like Dungeons and Dragons is often described as a generic fantasy, but D&D fantasy is not Harry Potter. It's not Lord of the Rings. It's not Game of Thrones. If you tried to tell those stories with D&D, you'd have to tear huge sections of the book out, to make it work the same way, and change a bunch of other things to make it work the same way. So, and a lot of role-playing games aren't necessarily. You had a problem with generic games like D&D or Mekton Zeta, which couldn't make up their mind what they wanted to be. Did they want to be a grim and gritty genre where people are getting shot, or do they want to be Gurren Lagann's "Let's Shoot the Sun," that sort of thing? And trying to model everything isn't ideal. I mean, to get back on mechanics, I think this is why you saw a much better success rate with games that tried to step away from the mechanics and push more of the setting. Like Vampire the Masquerade. Vampire the Masquerade isn't generic vampires. Vampire the Masquerade is very specifically a certain kind of vampire. And
it's very much conspiracy and occultism combined into a modern setting.
Yeah,
right.
It was urban fantasy. That's what it was. Very much 1990s urban fantasy.
But it's not True Blood. It's not the Vampire Lestat. It's not Underworld, despite the lawsuit.
It's not Vampire Diaries.
Very specific kind. Definitely not Twilight. It's a very specific kind, a vampire, which allowed them to do their City by Night books and their source books. And sell that. And I don't know if that was by design, but it's a good thing they pushed that, because that allowed them to support it without necessarily drowning the books in new rules. That happened a little bit later, but I think they were up on that. But
I do have an exception to saying that they were not drowning the rules, because I do have and this might be just somebody outsider looking in kind of way, but I do believe that there's a thing, hard rules, soft rules, where the hard rule is your dice mechanics, your card mechanics, your, conflict resolution mechanics. But your soft rules is like a description of a city, because that's a rule that says that in LA in 1995, the vampire rule has this king or this queen or this duke, right? And that's the rule, unless the players go like, I don't like that, so I'm going to throw it away. It may not be a dice rule, but it is a rule that the setting is saying, yeah, this is the way things are.
And I would like to stress, I wanted. So I know sometimes folks talk about crunchy or fluffy or hard and soft, and that's also what I'm getting at here, which is interesting you brought that up. The idea that lore is something that's soft, and I have to emphasize here the idea that lore is malleable, but rules are something that are supposed to be meticulously interpreted. And I have to say that my own experience with extremely lore-heavy games like Legend of the Five Rings or Vampire is that lore is not flexible. If it showed up in novels, or this is the specific hierarchy, or this person's in charge of this borough, you show up in someone's game, that's the way it is. So what I'm getting at by mechanics is I'm pointing out that I think the reason why people might call lore soft is because lore isn't something you have a lot of control over. If you show up as a player, lore is something that's presented to you in most games. As, welcome to Vampire, here's the Camarilla. This is the way it is. It's presented to you, whereas mechanics is stuff that you actually manipulate. And that's why a lot of, you can have games that are extremely lore heavy, but mechanics light. They can still be restrictive, but also it's like, it's not that you're making mistakes. You didn't make the lore was presented to you.
that also can be a bit of a wall as well, because say Shadowrun, one of my favorite games. I love the setting. I love the way they did, the way they mix Tolkien and Neuromancer, right? Gibson, although Gibson famously has said many times in his own Twitter, he doesn't like Shadowrun. He officially hates it, but they did it and they pull it off. But it also can be daunting. Like, everybody who knows Shadowrun, there's one name that they know, and you know that they know. It's sort of the sibling. That's Dunkelsen. I just say Dunkelsen, and you know what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a decade's worth of lore in just one name.
I'm going to stop you right there, because also Dunkelson couldn't run for president because he's not a native-born citizen of the United States. I just want to remind people of that.
But, he kind of did in the UCAS, which is kind of the complicated thing. But I know where you're going at. Yeah, I know.
What I mean by mountains of mechanics multiply mistakes. He can't run for president. He's not a natural-born citizen of the United States.
True enough.
But
true enough. But yeah, no, I think actually did he manage? I don't want to get into the whether or not he actually did that, because
I know but I would like to ask: has anybody here had a situation? All right, I guess the last thing I would ask is about rules lawyering, which is where you run into a problem where you show up at a game and you want to build a character and they won't let you do it, but somebody else already has a character that's like the way you want it, but they say, oh, we don't let new people do that. We let him do that because he did that before, but now we know better. Has that ever happened to any of you?
Not necessarily in that specific way, but definitely in the way of, like, we're going to give exceptions to this person, but we're not going to give you these exceptions. Usually because of the relationship between those two people. So I think on a previous time I mentioned, like, the world's worst GM, but at the time, at least once he decided to be a player, and his girlfriend at the time was running the game and would give exceptions to that character, but not to others, of course. So immediately,
but that's not the same thing as mechanic. See, if you played the long, I played Hero System for over 10 years, and that if you played the Hero System, that inevitably happens. They say, well, we let this person build an archer character which uses a specific kind of build, but we don't let new players do that because we can't make them delete their old character. That character has history, but we can't let you do that because we know these rules are broken. So this person gets to play with a broken character and you don't. Has that ever happened to any of you?
Yeah, it has happened to me several times, yeah. And mostly it's actually with superhero games, not just Hero, because I remember playing a lot of Mayfair DC heroes as well, and Marvel superheroes, which everybody loves, except me. For me, I don't like it. I prefer Marvel Saga, which is something completely different. But yeah, superhero games are infamous for being generically unbalanced because they try to emulate all the comic books, right? Your Batmans and your Supermans, your Iron Mans and your Thors, and Daredevil. So
yeah, not even the movies try to do that.
Yeah.
Now, with Hero System, actually, funny example, it is optimal for every single character to become increasingly fast to the point of being what is obviously superhuman. But obviously not every character concept is a super speed character. So immediately, anytime you play, you will have to put your foot down and say, this is as much speed as you can get without it being some sort of specific power.
Well, that gets into, like I said, the optimization problem. Like you see the same thing in, I don't know if it was true in Red, but it was true in every other version of Cyberpunk, which is you want your reflexes stat at 10 or higher. Reflexes controls dodging and shooting. You want that as high as possible. There's no reason not to max it out.
Yeah, it is the all combat stat.
Yeah. It will keep you alive. There's no reason to balance in anything else. Yeah, mostly really what the 4M I think is more advice. I think you're seeing a lot more games these days taking the 4M rule to heart. In theory, the old school revival is supposed to be that folks are writing simpler games where you just, they want to go back to that 83 basic set that they remember, where you just rolled a die and did something. I say in theory because I see a lot of them grafting a lot of more crap onto it because you can't just, the book has to have text in it. But there's also...
but the thing is, was it really simple? Because, for example, if you look, Griffin mentioned it a little moment, you look at the saving throws of the old style, they don't make any sense to anybody who reads it first time. Why do you have a save versus rot staves, and wands on one, and then death magic on the other. Now, somebody who's played it, we just accept it. But
I will completely agree that D&D 5th edition has finally done a smart thing and said, just roll a stat, buddy. You know, you've got 6 of the stats, just roll a stat. Because, because for some reason saving throws had to be separate from stats. That was because they had this huge, stupid idea in D&D that stats were meaningless and everything had to be controlled by your level. No, you're right. It's just simpler. There were even 1980s games. I mean, Call of Cthulhu is very popular, and it was a 1980s game, and it started with the idea of just roll stats, buddy. They're right there. You know, just if you need to resist being knocked down, just roll your strength. We're done. It's obvious.
That is an interesting sort of thing to, I think, maybe look at the directness of a set of rules. Because, say, like in Wicked Ones, which we've been doing, you just roll that skill, period, and that's all you have to do. But like in a lot of other games, there's a lot of derivative statistics based on the original numbers, and the question, with Pathfinder
how do you resist being knocked down? But how do you resist being knocked down in Pathfinder?
Good question. I don't know. I'd have to go look.
There's a separate stat which is for your grappling and attack
defense
bonus.
Which is separate from your normal melee attack.
No, I was mentioning that to make the point. It's kind of like I don't want to disparage folks who like a lot of mechanics. I like a very crunchy and meticulous game, but I don't like playing a game where I'm playing it with other folks who aren't at the same level of rules. Like, I recognize that not everyone's going to be at the same level of rules, and the problem with a really complicated game is if it's got a lot of crunchy rules to it and you need to manipulate these for maximum advantage, and not everybody at the table wants to do that. That's why I think you've seen like a big now that we've got people streaming games and those get away from that and are very much, story driven and performative driven. You've seen a big change away from that, and I think it's a sign of the times that no one seems to remember Rolemaster at all. It hasn't inherited, despite it was the number 2 role playing game for at least a decade. It has faded into obscurity.
Yeah.
Mm.
I have a player who used to play Rolemaster and will not shut up about it.
You mean someone else other than me?
They're out there, yeah.
I mean, I still praise the West End Games D6 system. I like my
D6 is really simple.
Yeah, but I like my pips. It's very simple, but one thing I want to see with Duncanson is, and also Star Wars, is that even lore itself can be daunting. Because if I need to know certain things, right, in order to understand the world, like, go read these 20 novels that we published, right? It's like, it might be too much. In fact, that's one of the rules I did with Griffin's game, because I'm running a Greyhawk game, which has close to 35 years of history, give and take, when it's supported and not, right? And I said, look, don't worry. Don't worry about what happened in the Greyhawk Wars or that guy who decided to put a name on an entire nation called Jeff or something. That's not important. You're not playing there. You're playing here. If you have any questions if you have a question about this particular place at this particular time, I'll try to answer the best I can. And if you want to do your own independent research, no problem. But I'm not going to burden you with decades worth of lore about, in Forgotten Realms. In fact, they did that for the Forgotten Realms. They basically said anything that happened before 2011, 2012, it's not, doesn't work. They essentially rebooted the entire lore of Forgotten Realms.
And Elminster's still immortal and boning goddesses.
I do have the stats for Elminster in the box set. They're there, and that you can clearly see that was a character that was made right on the page. That character never played. That character had so many psionic powers.
Yeah, but in fact, I think that's fine. So I think I hadn't thought about this, but I guess we need a 4L rule, like loads of lore lead to losing or something. I don't know. Because you're absolutely right. There are games I won't play. I won't play Vampire or Legend of the Five Rings, because every time I've played them, I get hammered by a bunch of lore that's in hundreds of pages. I mean, this is why D&D sort of has its reputation of being generic, because when you show up at a D&D game and they give you a character, a lot of the presentation is let's have fun and let's create our own story, and it's presented as that. Whereas a game like Vampire or some extent Shadowrun are presented as no. In actually, is it 2012 anymore when the Mayan calendar expired? Did they change that date? I forget.
I think it is 2012 when that happens, when magic starts returning, but it takes like another 10 years for stuff to like actually settle in.
Something like that. I mean, in other words, I know enough of the lore. I know enough of the lore to be familiar with it, but still not enough to actually play it. And it's like, I'll read 7 Harry Potter books before I read
In
that.
fact, that even affected the Shadowrun trilogy. I spoke to, in trivia many years ago, one of the designers, and one of the questions was like, hey, listen, you're talking a very complex game. How do you transfer it back to your computer, right? How do you put it there? It's like, yeah, one of the reasons why we started even before, the first book was because there's so much lore that it doesn't make sense. In fact, one of the things you kind of do in 2 of the games is that you essentially are setting up things that will happen later on. So people who know the lore is like, yeah, I know about those insect spider people. They're evil. They're going to do this. But somebody who's just playing is like, no, they're just evil insect people that you have to kill, right? I know about dragons, if you know about the lore, but it's a cool thing that you discover what dragons are in the video game. But if you say, for example, buy the latest edition, it's 5th edition or 6th edition of Shadowrun, it has a huge lore because they talk about being 2070 or something. And the game started at 2060, I think, originally, or 2050. I don't know. So there's a lot of stuff there.
Right, with Shadowrun, like you need to map out like an entire global system just to like understand how your one group of Shadowrunners like investigating the local water supply is going to like pan out across everything else. It's like, this is absurd.
I mean, I feel a little bad that this is negative because we're talking about as game. I mean, we're all in agreement that I think that what you see in the modern streaming stuff, like the shows people really like Critical Role, are very much embracing the idea of being very creative and involving players, both in the lore creation and also, as we discussed on when we were saying more performative, we're talking about things that actually enhance the experience, like deciding on the experience we want, and then picking mechanics and lore that go along with that experience, rather than, I do think we are past it keeps creeping up, but we're mostly past the era of, like lots and lots of rules. Because I think, I don't know, it's just a weird paradox where people want lots and lots of rules, but they don't actually want to use it.
Yeah, I also think that mechanizing Session 0, which is something I like to do in my own games, right, is important. Having that sort of introductory space where the players can sit down, discuss about the game, and make it part of the rules so that it doesn't feel like improvisation. Yeah. It feels like, okay, everybody has a place in it, and everybody said, like, here's the table, here's your, whatever, read the book, and we'll come back on Tuesday with your character and start playing. You're like,
I definitely think we should devote like a different, because we're almost out of time here, but devote like a podcast Session 0, because I'm anti Session 0, and I'll tell you all about why I hate it.
Yes.
Wow.
Grr. But that's I think we're all in agreement that most the game the phrase we like to use is the game should be as simple as possible, but no simpler. And that's a difficult thing for design. So I don't know, any like closing thoughts? Like, Red, did you have something you wanted to add?
What? No. What I'll say is that I think it's interesting. I think in this podcast, we focus a lot on simulation style games, which I think is because that's where a lot of our personal history comes from, and our love of these games come from these very crunchy, interesting games. I personally have been discovering more and more of our exceptionalist games, right? The ones that are maybe a little more role play heavy, maybe a little less intimidating mechanically. And I've noticed that a lot of these games will give the players all the rules they need to play the game on their character sheet. Like, it all fits on one page. I think that's really cool. I think that's a cool direction to go in. Obviously, you have to balance that against the depth and the breadth of the game that you want to play. But yeah, I like that kind of stuff. So that's my 2 cents. That's where I sit on this particular issue.
Definitely. No, yeah. Well, my company publishes Powered by the Apocalypse games, which very much have that ethos of everything in front of you, because that empowers players, whereas lots of rules can scare players off.
Yeah, I think that in the future, I think this probably will also evolve into discussion on how games are marketed and affects the decisions that go into what rules are and how complex they are and everything else. And that perspective, I think, something that
Yeah,
also
because
very important.
that's the huge problem. As a person who's been in the industry, the retailers and players of the games tell me they want the game to be supported. But you can't do what TSR did of just publishing like lore and monsters, because only the game master buys monsters, and players outnumber game masters at least 4-1. That's why World of Darkness sold so much better with lore books. A city book or a clan book, you could sell it to players. So when D&D 3rd edition launched in 2000s, you had like, here's a book for more fighter options. Here's a book for more sorcerer options. They started selling more stuff geared towards players. And that's what gets the money. Somebody who makes their own random, here's 30 more options for sorcerer, OGL stuff. That's what sells. And then you have the problem where a lot of this stuff is poorly vetted. But it's this weird paradox of where people want more stuff for the game, and they want stuff that empowers their characters because they're not going to pay money for stuff that doesn't. But they also say they don't want more rules.
Yeah, which is why I hate Splat, because I grew up with Splat, and I was like, my closet, if I were to put all the books I ever owned in this closet, I would need 2 of these or 3 of these closets just to get about half the collection.
Okay.
Kevin.
Any other so mechanics, we're against them.
Yeah.
I guess is our consensus.
All right. So if that's the note we're going to end off on, then let's go ahead and do it. So that's going to be it for this episode of Notes from the Aleph. Everybody, we stream episodes bi-weekly Friday at 2 p.m. Eastern. You can join us live on twitch.tv/Ractus. We also stream and record weekly tabletop games at the same channel, and you can come join us when we start at 10 a.m., 2 p.m., and 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on Sundays and Wednesdays. Norman Rafferty here is a partner and writer at Sandwich Games. Check out sandwichgames.com and join the Reddit and Twitter, and look forward to the upcoming Book of Corals Ironclaw expansion, where you can engage your own pirate adventure. Don't forget to check out RedRabbit's book and RedRabbit and booking for a game over on startplaying.games as Oracular Pig. And Lessons, why don't you give a shout out to your channel real quick too?
Yes, stream games every night over at Lessons Learned channel, Lessons Learned 1. The 1 is important. I am also a writer of speculative fiction. You can find my first short story collection over at Amazon.com for 99 cents. It's called Knights, as in Knights of Chivalry, and Stars. And of course, I am also a GM here on Sundays. I run the Into the Wild Coast Greyhawk 5th edition adventure.
Yep, so be sure to join us then. And of course, be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and come see us all again.